So we're going to go straight to our first session. And when I had the idea to put this all together, two names came to my mind that I knew I had to invite and try and convince to be part of this, and that was Holly Herndon and Mat Dryhurst. Unfortunately, Holly and Matt can't make it in person today since we continue to live in these very uncertain times, but they're going to be joining us now in the 2.5 dimension live from Berlin. So machine learning, audio deepfakes, Web3 powered artistic autonomy, Holly Herndon and Mat Dryhurst wield diverse technological and discursive tools, all of which garnered their inclusion in this year's ArtReview Power 100, where they were described, quote, as indispensable guides to our digital future. Holly Herndon is an American multidisciplinary artist. Her work involves augmentation of her voice and image, facilitated by critical research in artificial intelligence and decentralized infrastructure. Actually, Guy, can we close the door now, please? Thank you. And Matt teaches in the NYU Clive Davis Institute in Berlin, and importantly, he can be known to subtweet himself at an impressive frequency and intensity, and he's sporting a very symbolically loaded mustache right now. Bring. Will you please welcome Mat Dryhurst and Holly Herndon. Hello. Earth calling Houston. Can you hear us, Houston?
We can. Thank you so much for having us. We're both very disappointed that we can't be there with you personally. I've actually never been to Dubai and was really looking forward to the trip, but unfortunately Matt got COVID. So I'm happy to be here virtually.
Matt got COVID. Matt, you have personal history with the region. Please tell us more.
Yeah, I do. I grew up in Kuwait. So actually I had a whole trip planned. I was going to fly my dad over. We were going to hang out. I haven't been to Dubai since I was 13 or something like that. Yeah, so very, very melancholy to not be there, but fortunately feeling more human there.
When were you in Kuwait? What years?
From 1984 to 2000.
Wow.
So the first 16 years of my life.
So you did Desert Storm, the non-video game version.
Yeah, exactly. That's a whole other session. But
we'll save that for a separate session.
Yeah,
okay, so what I want to do, because there's so many things we could talk to each other about, but I've picked out a number of what I believe are actually, because this is the first session of the weekend. It's also a kind of primer as well, and I think I want to get our audience in the mood, and I think the scope of what you both do covers a huge amount of territory in this space, and that's why, again, it was so important that you were part of this. So I wanted to start really with the question when and how you got pilled. So if we go back to the kind of origin myths, and the way I remember you guys came around for dinner a few years ago, and if there's one thing, if you want to get Matt going on a kind of 2-hour-long monologue, you just bring up one word, and that one word is Spotify. And then you'll get the most incredible kind of discourse about exactly how and why Spotify is one of the most evil forces in the world. But am I right in thinking, because in a way, it seems to me that the relationship between your experience in a music world that very much got dominated by Web 2 economics, but also ideology, which has resulted in these like pitiful remuneration business models for artists and the billions ultimately for the platform capitalists. That versus the promises of a Web3 future or a Web3 infrastructure or a Web3 cultural system, which at the very least would provide a more equitable revenue model for creators. Is that one of the ways you got pilled, or did you get pilled before that? Or how do those two things come together in terms of your history with with crypto, with Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Web3?
I think that's probably how I got the most pilled. When the music industry moved to the internet and kind of adopted this per play valuation of music, for me, it was immediately clear this is not going to work for challenging music because it's going to incentivize background music, multiple plays. So I knew that this was going to be devastating for the kind of music that I care about the most. It was kind of a combination of not just the payment aspect, which is of course huge, but also the kind of inability for artists to kind of control how the work was being even presented or distributed in a kind of creative way with all kinds of, shadowy recommendation systems. So for me, it was really about the kind of artist agency in that ecosystem. And then I think for Matt, it was probably with Saga, or?
Yeah, I do have to say, even though I guess I probably made my name on Twitter from being the most vocal anti-Spotify person, it was actually Holly who initially pilled me on the anti-Spotify position. Because I remember when the service started, I was initially, gave it a little bit of time, and Holly came forward with what I still think is the most devastating critique, which is that it is absurd to value art on a per play basis, right? Like, can you imagine valuing a Tarkovsky movie based on how many times you watched it, or a book on how many times you read it? This is a logic that works very specifically for pop music, but not very well for anything else. It's absurd once you view it from that lens. So I'll give Holly credit. It took me actually a couple of years to come around to that position. But I would say around about 2013. I started working on, it was a decentralized publishing protocol called Saga. It was initially an art project, an art experiment. But the basic idea was, what would happen if you gave artists agency over how their work was distributed and viewed online? And that started basically kind of a bit of a rabbit hole deep dive, thinking, well, if you change certain very small interactions and put those interactions in the hands of artists as opposed to platforms, all of a sudden the creative ecosystem would look very different. And all the dependencies that we have on top of these platforms would change. Journalism would change. Interactions and economies would change. And so from that, this would have been about 2013, 2014 is when that project finally went live. A bunch of people from the then nascent Ethereum community were reaching out to us and saying, well, some of the ideas that you're exploring here could be described as smart contracts, for example. We didn't necessarily have the language for that at the time, but I think that's around about, it's quite extreme to say pilled, because at the time...
It was a slow release, maybe, started with a placebo and,
Well, exactly, but I think that's one thing that I am quite proud of in some ways, is that, we came to this space because we had come to certain conclusions that this space ultimately fulfilled and was satisfying. And this was around about 2014, 2015. We'll say on Holly's record platform that we worked on together that came out in 2015, there was a piece of art and that ended up becoming a piece of music on there called DAO, that was published a year before the first DAO was published. These at the time were just simple ideas that clicked and made some sense. So from then, obviously we've been very engaged with the community and specifically corners of the community that have some crossover with the arts. Yeah.
Thank you. And tell us, what was the crypto community like at that point? We're sort of 4 or 5 years after, I guess, the white paper, something like that. You guys you've been in Berlin now. How long is this? How long you guys have been in Berlin now?
Now we've been here for like 5 or 6 years.
5 or 6 years.
6 years.
We met in Berlin and then had a 10-year stint in California and then came back around about 2015.
No, before that.
Was it? Oh.
2013?
I don't know.
Time, who knows?
Anyways,
Time doesn't matter anymore.
But I'm just sorry. I'm curious because obviously now we're much more used to. Dubai is becoming one of these crypto hubs, right? And incredible frequency of conferences, events, hackathons. Solana just did a big thing 2 weeks ago, you know, and so we're now up to that stage. But I'm curious whether, you know, again, when you got introduced to the space, whether was it mostly happening online? Was it happening IRL? What kind of, how did those communities form?
Well, actually, in Berlin at the time, Matt, with a mutual friend of ours, TCF, started a Slack channel that was dedicated to people who were interested in kind of creative use cases of blockchain. So it was like kind of a weird mix of internet artists and developers and people who were just curious on the topic. And we would kind of host salons in our studio, you know, once a month or so, where we would just get people together in the same room talking about ideas. And it wasn't really structured in any kind of way, but it was kind of almost like a subculture, you could say. And I think Berlin's really unique for that, in that, you know, I've interacted with some kind of Web3 communities in other cities, and I think each city has its own kind of flavor. And Berlin, very kind of true to itself, is very kind of arts and kind of communal project focused.
Yeah, that's my recollection of it too. I mean, there was always the Bitcoin community, and Berlin has a special history. You know, I mean, you could buy beer with Bitcoin in 2013 in Kreuzberg.
I think the first Ethereum block was...
Well, the Ethereum Genesis block was published in Kreuzberg.
Right.
That's something people don't know. But my recollection at the time was a lot of stragglers. I mean, and that's one of the interesting things that I think is perpetuated with it. I mean, of course, now you have like enterprise blockchain, all this kind of, you know, big business stuff. But generally speaking, my recollection is a lot of people who were working on, let's say, like open source software projects, things like platform cooperatives, made the migration over to Ethereum, you know, around about 2015, 2016. All of a sudden that became the focus of concentration, because all of a sudden you could do more with the blockchain. And so, yeah, my recollection of it all was stragglers from different fields, albeit the arts, music, web development communities, who are like, oh, there's new toys. You know, what can we do with these new toys? And of course, lots of things have happened since then. It's quite peculiar that all these things be associated as one coherent scene.
Sure.
Because my understanding is that there are, you know, 20, 30 different approaches and scenes in this space, and at the time it was very innocent.
and how does it feel now? I mean, what role do you think? If it seems to me that, I mean, the way I've been thinking about it is, you know, the traditional financial world has its kind of nodal centers, right? Has Frankfurt, New York, Paris, Singapore, Dubai, you know, certainly over the last decade or so. Now we're seeing an emergence, certainly within crypto, of a different network, right? A different set of nodal points, arguably Miami, Tulum, Lisbon, Berlin, Dubai, hopefully Singapore, although that's, you know, question mark, obviously, in terms of regulation. But what role do you think Berlin plays within that network now?
That's a really good question. I mean, I still think it's a pretty big node on that kind of map. There are several projects here there, especially in the kind of creative side. But I think a lot of this is kind of TBD, depending on future regulatory choices. So I think everyone's kind of holding their breath a little bit. But there is still a lot of energy here, I think, in the Web3 space.
Yeah, something we've discussed quite a lot on the podcast is I don't think that the city of Berlin, in fact, I know this, really has acknowledged its place in the genesis of a lot of these tools. As we said, like, you know, Ethereum the Genesis block was published in Kreuzberg. Web3, the term was coined by Gavin Wood, who started the Web3 Foundation and Polkadot in Kreuzberg. Gnosis, who were responsible for building pretty much all the DAO tooling, was started by Martin Koppelman in Kreuzberg. That there's been communities here closer to where we are, like between different communities. We participate in things like Trust, the great art space in Schöneberg, have been around forever. And there is this kind of odd subculture of very tech literate artists and critics that have been in Berlin and become, I believe, like quite influential in this space. I mean, I noticed that Terra Zero is presenting a project in Dubai this week.
I think one reason for that also, if I can just interject, is there was a period of time when kind of capital C cryptography, not crypto, the kind of currency, where kind of like privacy tools and journalism and things like this, these were really big topics in the German government. There was a lot of protection around journalism. There was a lot of EU funding to protect journalists' interests. And so, Edward Snowden is a hero in Berlin, things like this. So I think some of that grew out of that organically. But as Matt mentioned, it's not clear that the German government's necessarily seeing this as a kind of extension of that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So moving forward, but also back to 2020. And apparently, interestingly enough, yesterday was the 2-year anniversary of the official pandemic. Or the pandemic being announced as a global pandemic was 2 years yesterday. Wow. Now, this meant, this obviously hit anybody in the performing arts. I mean, it hit everybody in one way or the other, but I think those of you in the performing arts, musicians, your work life, in a sense, came to a kind of grinding halt, right? And especially when it comes to like revenue streams, given the backdrop of how little artists, most artists make from music sales exclusively, right? So over the last years, we've seen touring become like a very important component of artists' income. That came to a grinding halt. Instead, you started Interdependence, a podcast, which has been one of the most alpha-rich spaces concerning Web3 and NFTs and digital culture in general. Again, to me, it's very clear why you started this and when you started it. But we'd love to know, what did you hope to achieve at the beginning, and where does it fit in this broader timeline of how early and how late we are in the space?
I think you should take this because this was your idea.
Yeah, I mean, well, basically, when we were working, so from about 2017 to 2019, we were doing a lot of work in the machine learning space that we've continued now. And one of the ideas that came up around that record was, again, kind of going back to this principle of now having the ability to kind of establish your own context and publish things as you would like. We floated around the idea of doing a podcast in order to establish a context for people to receive the work, because generally speaking, when you're dealing with things that are kind of on the bleeding edge, many people come to these topics, particularly when it comes to AI, and certainly now when it comes to crypto, come to these topics with certain preconceived ideas of what's going on. And it was like, oh no, it would be a cool opportunity to actually just publish conversations with people who are working a pretty high level in these fields, because for those who might be interested. And so, yeah, when the pandemic happened, it was actually, it was obviously an ideal opportunity to do it. It also kind of worked as a quasi social relief, kind of like parasocial relief from lockdown. But the bigger idea was saying, what would it mean if we would, in a sense, kind of open up and freely publish our thoughts as these artworks are coming together. And so ostensibly any research that we do is then made available to other people who might be interested. And fortunately, it turns out there's a significant number of people who are interested, because there is a bit of a dearth of kind of high level exploration of these very exciting things.
Mm-hmm. And could you say how, it's intimately linked with Patreon. So could you say something about that economic model? I want to talk about channel and what you're doing more in a little bit, but it'd be great to talk, for other people to sort of understand how the creator economy has worked so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that was the other idea there, is saying, around about these kind of like Web 2.5 things like a Patreon and a Substack were starting to gather steam. We'd seen things like, for example, the Chapo Trap House people doing quite well by publishing a podcast. So people, it seemed, were prepared to pay, $5 a month to be accompanied by disembodied voices talking about things, and so that definitely helped too. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, mostly just kind of to make sure that the time was compensated, and to give. The one wonderful thing we spent, I think, our career doing this is it was also incredibly validating to be able to go direct to people and say, okay, we have this strange idea. will people value it enough to make it worth the time? And they absolutely have. So you know, I think this speaks a little bit to like Holly's critique when it comes to streaming. Ultimately, is that, you know, you never want to necessarily kind of exclude somebody for not being able to pay, right? There's only so many $5 a month things you can pay a month. But there is something really meaningful to somebody coming forward and saying, no, actually, I value this to the tune of $5 a month. That is a more kind of meaningful connection, ultimately, I believe, than, you know, the like and kind of stream economy. There's something very special about that, and ultimately, you know, the ability to grow an audience and maintain those connections, and can then dream about what you might build going forward with that support is, it was a bit of a lifeline at that point, because we really did get hit by COVID. We didn't moan about it all that much, but you know, it was
we lost all of our income.
Yeah, I mean,
that's pretty much the definition of a hit, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, and beyond that, even, you know, not to kind of whine, but even the cruelty of it happening when it did. You know, we were just ramping up. We work in like 3 or 4 year time cycles. We work on really big, ambitious projects, and all those bookings were wiped out with no assurances that they were ever going to come back. Yeah. You know, and so the cruelty of it, the dent of confidence of that was also something that was quite difficult to deal with, not going to lie.
Yeah. And actually that leads me on to my next topic, which is delving into NFTs, right? And it feels like that's another, I mean, obviously you've been aware of it for a very, very long time, but you then engaged in them, not just discursively, not just as topics on your podcast, but you actually started to make NFTs. So I wanted to ask you, and I think there's an interesting part of that is there's a whole visual aspect now to the NFT work, and which is becoming more and more of your work. So could you tell the audience something first about the kinds of NFTs, why you decided to do them, what you decided to do, and then if you could tell us who Holly Plus is, that would be great. Okay.
Sure. So I think I can speak for both of us in saying that we've always kind of identified more as artists rather than purely musicians. So we've been doing kind of theater works and installation work for a long time, but you know, some of the kind of just industrial realities of our work is that we needed to focus on making records and touring those records to have a sustainable practice. So after the initial kind of shock of COVID, that was no longer going to be possible, once we kind of licked our wounds, we started to do an even deeper dive on some of the machine learning work that we've been doing around the voice that Matt can explain in a minute with Holly Plus. We started working with that more in the visual realm. I think we're both at this point very much obsessed with how machine learning is changing the way that artists are able to create work, the way that we're able to collaborate, and even the kind of very concept of like what creativity and the origin of an idea is, I think is changing through these tools. So we just spent copious amounts of hours working with text animation machine learning tools and started creating some videos and also still images. And so I'm not exactly sure what was the kernel of reason for the first NFT release. We had this series that we had collaborated with Reza Negarestani called Crossing the Interface that we released we did a performance in the Guggenheim in, I believe, 2014. And that was a decentralized kind of performance because my soprano was in Oklahoma and she was being spatialized into the gallery space in New York. And it was this really beautiful libretto that Reza wrote specifically for that performance. And so when we were thinking about doing a series of NFTs, we wanted to kind of go back to that early work that was kind of at the moment when we started really seriously thinking about decentralization and some of the potential that it had. And so we started combining that with some of the machine learning tools that we'd been experimenting with and found a really, I think, unique visual language to pair with that poetry from Reza.
Yeah, I mean, and beyond obviously, wanting to participate in a new market was part of the discussion.
Yeah.
Naturally over COVID, the fact that there was a new collector base emerging felt like an opportunity, and particularly also for us, it doesn't feel like a stretch given our long engagement in the space. All of a sudden, it was like, this is actually mature enough now that, for example, you can host a 50 megabyte video file and connect that to a token, right? This is all quite new and exciting. But I think for me personally, the most interesting thing, like, how to put this, the ability to establish provenance, I think takes on some kind of profound implications, specifically in the machine learning space that we've been working on. And so most of the works that we've been doing, we started with Crossing the Interface. We did the Classified series, which is a self-portraiture series exploring what the clip dataset knows about Holly. And so the idea of exploring provenance in this messy world of kind of new IP, new ways of playing with people's identity just felt, it feels conceptually consistent. And in fact is, we'll talk about Holly Plus in a second, but all of a sudden tools are emerging to do the kind of things that we were trying to talk about in 2016. And so at no point did we ever feel, excuse me, at no point did we ever feel that this was a departure from what we were doing. Far from it. It's just the tools all of a sudden exist to explore things that we've already covered. You're probably going to ask me to explain what Holly Plus is now.
Who is she? Is she a she? Am I misgendering Holly Plus?
Whoever you want them to be.
She's fluid.
Yeah.
She's fluid.
I mean, do you want to explain Holly Plus?
You do it. I feel like you'd do a more concise job than I would.
All right. Okay. So the preamble to this, from about 2016, 2017, we did a lot of work with machine learning and the voice. And the basic idea was training a voice to be able to sing as opposed to speak. There's been a lot of research in terms of speaking neural networks. We were focusing on singing neural networks, and particularly this idea of timbre transfer, or the idea of being able to transfer a sound into another sound using a machine learning model. The record that came out in 2019, Proto, was pretty much built around this. And one of the kind of side conversations with that record was thinking about attribution. What does it mean all of a sudden when other people can not just sample somebody, but we came up with the term spawn somebody, right? When all of a sudden you're not taking a David Bowie sample and pitching it up or pitching it down and recontextualizing it in that way. All of a sudden you can be Bowie. You can get Bowie to say or sing what you would like. What does that mean? And particularly, what does that mean for a public figure who's documented in open public data sets like Holly? I mean, you can go right now and generate approximations of Holly's face using publicly available OpenAI datasets. And that's what we did with Classified. And so Holly Plus really was about saying, rather than kind of leaning into or buying into the catastrophism around deepfakes, right? How instead do you see this as kind of a creative opportunity where we look at the identity of public figures as kind of an open thing, and think and try and devise economic configurations that would allow for a public figure to participate in the benefits or the profits generated from their likeness, right? And so with Holly Plus, the first thing we did was a collaboration with some friends of ours called Never Before Heard Sounds, was create a website where anybody can upload a piece of audio and Holly will send back that audio to you. Where we're going now with it, we have a tool. It's honestly, it's remarkable. I wish I could play it for you. We have a tool that will produce almost perfect, imperceptibly different Holly voice. And you can use it as a real-time voice transfer plugin. So
Matt actually performed as me at Sonar this year.
I was going to ask you I wish we had this clip because it went very viral, and I think people got the chills. I know people who were in the audience, but could you describe what happened during that performance?
Yeah, so we were performing, the whole thesis is, rather than thinking about sampling, we've got to think about spawning, which is a whole new paradigm, right? Rather than thinking about IP, intellectual property, and lockdown, why don't we think about identity play? What does it mean for you to be able to be somebody else and create a fair economic arrangement in that. And so we went and played a show at Sonar where we basically talked about some of the stuff and demonstrated some of the software, and yes, the finale was me singing as Holly with a song that we co-wrote for the last record. And for us, it's actually a really wonderful moment because, after 6 years of trying to explain to people super convoluted things, when you get me on stage and what comes out of my voice, what comes out of my mouth is her voice, you don't have to explain it anymore. It's really clear that, art has changed. I just don't think people have caught up to it yet. And I feel like that generally, specifically with the machine learning stuff on the research side, it has changed irrevocably. And so Holly Plus as a model, this idea of saying, how can we govern a digital identity? How can we maybe allow others to participate in the governance and the performance of that digital identity? I don't think that'll sound so crazy in 3 years' time.
I think a lot of people hear about this, especially musicians, and they immediately think, oh my gosh, how can I protect my IP? How can I kind of control it and lock it down? Because I feel like we've been taught that that's the way to kind of treat our material. And I really understand that impulse. I also had that at the beginning. But one thing that the kind of NFT space is kind of flipping on its head is this idea that the more kind of ubiquitous something is, the more valuable it can also be. The more shared it is for free, the more value it can have for one person who wants to own it or one iteration of that. So we're kind of taking that leap of faith and experimenting in that realm. And it's taken a little bit of trust and evolution of my own thinking to be comfortable with it. But now that it all has kind of crystallized and makes sense, I'm really excited to see how other people will perform through my likeness.
It's stunning. It's beautiful. I urge everybody to look up, I think, that performance in particular. So the next question is just to zoom out a little bit, thinking about the space at a more macro level. And I'm going to call this like bad romance. It seems to me that there are kind of two cardinal sins to crypto and Web3 that have become the mainstay of left critique, right? The first is that it's just hyper-financialization under new names. And the second is, of course, the ecological footprint, right? And now, I know over the last few months, you've produced a number of episodes of Interdependence around this very vexed question, and you've brought on a number of really interesting experts. So I thought it would be really interesting, but also important for you to maybe try and pass on to us what it is that we don't know about this topic. Because again, just for everybody who hasn't kept up with this, it became completely like a meme last year in particular, as crypto was taking off, as it was becoming more mainstream, for newspapers like The Guardian or even the New York Times to sort of reel out that Bitcoin uses the same energy as Argentina or Reykjavik, and as though that in itself was like a kind of self-contained immutable statement, but actually it's like, what the hell does that mean? Do I know how much electricity Reykjavik uses, really? But anyway, and it snowballed, and again, I would argue, it became the second leg of the way in which, crypto and Web3 and all of that, and NFTs, of course, have a very bad rep, especially with the kind of left critique space. So could you tell us something about the things that you've learned through the guests that you've had on your podcast on this vexed question, please?
For sure. I would say that almost every major media outlet that I've read a big piece on the kind of energy consumption has printed falsehoods or misleading statements. And This is hugely, hugely disappointing in an era of fake news where when people disagree with something, they can just say, oh, fake news, And so I'm really rooting for good journalism and really rooting for kind of like rigorous attempts at kind of tackling this complicated question. For me, the big takeaway after speaking with Jonathan Kumi, who's a kind of famous, became famous at the advent of the internet for trying to understand how we can kind of calculate distributed computing systems and how things scale, because at the time, many people were calling for that the internet would boil the oceans, but they were kind of miscalculating in certain ways. So we spoke to him and to many others. And the kind of takeaway that I had was, if you're really, really concerned about the environment, then focusing on crypto is probably not the best use of your own energy, because it has such a proportionally small impact on the kind of broader topic. 90 companies are responsible for 2/3 of global emissions. None of those companies are crypto companies. So then the question is, if this is not a question about actual impact on the environment, why is this topic so large? And I think it's because of the kind of the strange kind of attention lottery of the Web 2 space, where people are incentivized to create outrage in order to drive attention to themselves for their own kind of purposes. And so I don't think everyone engaging with this topic is so cynical, but I think there is actually a lot of competing interests there. And I think it's an inefficient way to work towards a kind of environmental politic.
Yeah, I mean, I think to build on that, I agree. I mean, global crypto emissions are kind of in the rounding error territory. We pulled that apart with a crypto skeptic, Carl McDonald, who did incredible work to bring some clarity to actual emissions and energy use in the Ethereum network. I absolutely recommend that episode. And the conclusion was, this is in rounding error territory. It's not insignificant at all. There's a lot of confusion related to, specifically NFTs. NFTs produce no marginal energy burn in the Ethereum network. It's not like when you mint one, a server spins up somewhere and uses more energy. Ethereum has a fixed energy use at any time. And in fact, there was a period of time when this was at its hottest, where NFT activity was going down, but the hash rate, or the kind of total energy expenditure of the network, was going up. And so this weird line of inquiry placing this focus on NFTs would mean logically that the only way to reduce this kind of per NFT energy transaction would be actually to mint more NFTs, right? Because Ethereum has a fixed energy use, so we should use it more, right? We should use the network way more in order to get the most value out of it. These are complicated and sensitive issues. I will say that, speaking to the financialization point, we had some great people on from this new project Context recently, and I came up with the term "the shock of the nude," which I was quite proud of. Where I think that really what we're seeing, the web is financialized. I personally don't believe that all interactions and all social interactions ought to be financialized, as many people in crypto don't. However, the web is already financialized. We just don't have access to those interfaces. We don't have access to that data. Opening that up is, of course, going to open up a crazy can of worms. Yeah. But I believe it's actually the shock of the nude. It's the shock of denuding that kind of opacity that people are responding to, not necessarily the promise of the tools, right? I think invariably when, the clicks will dry up for disaster pieces on crypto, the clicks will dry up because a lot of these protocols are capitalized for generations, right? So this isn't going away, irrespective of how much we dislike it. This isn't going away. The clicks will dry up, and what will happen in the next 8 to 18 months, I hope, is that a lot of skeptics will begin to understand and discern the difference between a Ria Myers and a Terra Zero and a Bored Ape Yacht Club, and understand that there are multifaceted outcomes that can come through the advent of these new tools. And actually, our efforts and our energies are best spent making this world suck less, using new tools available to us. And that's the camp that we're in. And that's also largely why we publish the podcast. We're certainly not shilling crypto. We invite kind of good faith skeptics on regularly. But it's our position that this is not going away. So all the better we learn to use it for hopefully progressive and interesting purposes.
Thank you. Now, I want to go back to another project, although it's a kind of euphemistic term to describe what channel is. And channel is something you dropped with a number of like-minded content creators, but also, I think, thinkers and critical mind. So could you tell us who Channel is, and what is a $5 grad school, and how does that begin to make a new Web3 media entity?
I'll let Matt talk about the $5 grad school, but
Yeah.
just a quick introduction. We're basically a collective of artists and writers, podcasters, and developers. At the beginning, we started out as a bundle of 3 podcasts. And as you mentioned earlier, speaking about Patreon, we noticed that we were kind of siloed in these 3 different Patreons, and that we had some crossover in our community, and people were paying the same fees to belong to 3 different podcasts, and that we were kind of incentivized through this model to compete with each other rather than to collaborate. So we kind of asked ourselves, what kind of tools could we develop and could we build in this Web3 space that would encourage people to collaborate rather than to necessarily compete? So in some ways, it's kind of like an a la carte magazine, but it's also this kind of evolving collaboration between all of these minds to try to figure out a new tool set for this new Web3 space.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a term in the space, dog fooding. The basic idea being that, like, oftentimes people will build tools, but or kind of put forward visions of how they would like institutions to look. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the most impactful thing ultimately is to build the thing and use it, right? And we felt that way. We're very critical of Web 2 platforms. We have our own ideas for how we would like this work to exist in the world. Same with our collaborators at New Models, Joshua Cinderella, very, very critical, I think, kind of important voices in this kind of new landscape. And so, yeah, the idea was, like, can we walk the walk? And so initially, we built it's a token unlock RSS feed, which is the first time those 2 things have ever been tied together. You can follow a magazine through having access to the token, and then from that, fortunately, because there was such a big response from the initial tokens, there's now a treasury which we're not touching, but an organization's being built, and so a bunch of the developers who put this project together, are making a C-suite and trying to make an organization for an open protocol for publishing in this manner. And so, yeah, it kind of falls into our...
And honestly, this feels like it would be impossible in the Web 2 paradigm, just to be able to kind of, we're so grateful to the community that we were able to fundraise and that we were able to kind of bootstrap this thing together. It's kind of a dream come true, and to be able to work with the team that we're working with is, it's incredible.
Yeah, someone within the group noted after we did an NFT sale to fundraise for the building out of the protocol that we managed to raise more money than the Airbnb seed round. And that's the world that we live in right now, and how wonderful. Right?
Yeah. I
mean, after a decade of people discussing, we could build this new institution, things could work slightly differently. How wonderful that there is actually a source of well-meaning people who want to see those things, in the world, and are willing to support that to that level. So
just to push that a bit further. I mean, one of the other things I know we've talked about a lot is what the word institution has meant and what it could mean in this space. Now, is Channel, is it the seeds of a new kind of institution? And is that something that you are interested in, kind of throwing your throwing your hat into the ring about? Because so far it seems to me, I mean, obviously, we could talk about DAOs also as a kind of one of these new institutions, arguably. But that aside, because there's a lot of talk about DAOs, but other than the Ethereum Foundation, other than VC-funded crypto companies, other than DAOs, other than OpenSea, when one thinks about cultural institutions, when one thinks about libraries, one thinks about museums, one thinks about the kind of cultural infrastructure that's been so important, much of which, at its very best, had been free, right? Is that, are your ambitions, not just you, but the people in the space, are the ambitions that big, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, those are big shoes to fill. So I wouldn't be so hubristic as to mention that. I mean, I will say, on the topic of institutional critique and reflection, I'd recommend our podcast with the incredible Shumon Basar.
He's a hack. He's a hack.
It was one of the most popular podcasts we've done, specifically with you talking about this, I have to say. But yeah, I in our corner of crypto, and we actually published this week in full for free a discussion with Jacob.eth, who's a collaborator and friend of ours, who coined this term hyperstructure. We were just at ETH Denver, which I think is where I got COVID, sadly. But all the discussion there was on how do we build protocols as public goods?
Right.
Thinking about, permanent, always open, always free,
non-rent seeking
utilities that are just available to people and will always work as they say they are, as some kind of a public good, and I think you could argue as a form of as a kind of an institutional framework, right? Yeah. And so, specifically thinking about channel, that is the intention. The intention is saying, okay, well, what kind of low-level tools can be provided to meet the needs initially of this first creator group, but can then just be given to people so that they do not need to depend on one centralized entity or another, and depend on their good graces in not changing how this thing works or changing the price or whatever it might mean. What would it mean to be able to build that as an open public good that could be given to everybody? And so in our corner of crypto, which I think is I mean, I say it's quieter, but ETH Denver, that was like all people were talking about. It's remarkable. Like, this is where the builders are at. It was Gitcoin, it was other internet talking about public goods. How do we make this cheap, free for everybody, and permanent? And so, yeah, that's definitely where our head is at with kind of most of the projects that we're working on in the crypto space. It's like, how do you develop these utilities that are going to help solve problems and be future-proofed? And of course, like, with a sprinkling of governance on top. So that's kind of where our head is at without speaking for the group as a whole.
But also just to hype our collaborators, do not research and do models a little bit. I mean, they've been covering topics that I think have been really difficult for some more established institutions to cover. Yeah. Josh particularly goes into some really dark areas of internet politics in a really elegant way. And also their communities are very generative. So they're creating new work around kind of things as they emerge. They're able to respond much faster than I think a maybe more traditional institution could do. So I think we're definitely framing ourselves as a new kind of institution that has kind of multiple facets.
Thank you. Just FYI audience, I'll open it up to questions, so please kind of get the cogs running in a minute. But just to kind of linger a little bit on this topic and push it a little bit further. I mean, every moment is acute in its own way, but right now it's acute in a very, arguably very specific way in terms of what's happening. The eastern border of Europe, we're seeing a war interface with crypto, with NFTs, in ways that one could either say is kind of for the good or actually not for the good. There's a widespread feeling by many people, and let's be honest, many very young people, that the future is in some way cancelled. And this term that I've been hearing more and more over the last couple of years, climate grief. It's not enough to simply say climate crisis anymore. It's gone beyond that. It's gone into climate grief. Now, in crypto, we have different sentiment analyses, different sentiment metrics. One of them is the fear and greed index, of course, which prints a figure on a dial every day for both Ethereum and Bitcoin. I'm thinking about, I think there could be a similar one, which is the optimism-pessimism index. Now, I wanted to ask you, both as creators working with new technologies, but also as very old-fashioned humans, where are you on that optimism-pessimism index? And do those two things completely align? or is there some gap between where you feel, because of where you're situated in that landscape? As you said, Matt, you've just been, and I know you told me how exciting you found being at ETH Denver and being amongst all these people and all those topics and things like that. But then there's often, how we feel on the inside that might be separate. So I'm just curious, where do you feel on that? Because as we know, it often feels like there's a much more mitigating evidence for us to feel pessimistic than optimistic today. So please.
I can go. I was funny. I was talking to a student about this week. My position, particularly, we actually changed. It was terrible timing, and I almost don't want to make a joke about it. But we changed the tagline of the podcast to "optimistic about the 21st century." It was like 3 weeks ago.
Oh wow!
Yeah, life comes at you fast, right? My personal position on optimism is that first off, like, I'm a pragmatist. Optimism is an unusual one because it can often be conflated with kind of mindless enthusiasm, but fundamentally, optimism for me is a very heavy burden in the sense that you have to factor all of the things that could go wrong and then still come out with something practicable and something to kind of motivate you to do something. And that's very much, I feel, our position in these things. You can make a career saying melancholy things about big topics, unaccountable melancholy things about big topics. From my personal position, there's many things to be concerned about related to the fields we care about, specifically crypto, let's say machine learning, AI, and yet we must do something. And so on a human level, I feel often very very not necessarily pessimistic, but very kind of daunted by the scale of things ahead, and see no recourse other than to try and have some quite interesting pragmatic ideas as to how to deal with that new situation. And that to me is an optimistic disposition.
Holly?
Well, I was raised in an extremely optimistic family in the American South. So that's kind of part of my blood that I can't get rid of. And then I spent decades in very pessimistic art circles in Europe. So I would say I probably fall somewhere in between, and, it's all contextual. But just to echo Matt a little bit, I think that the word critique has lost some meaning over the last several years. It's become a kind of de facto for rejection of the new. That's really disappointing because I welcome critique. We need critique. We need a multitude of different perspectives in order to make things better. But there is a kind of, there's not only a technical, but there's also a conceptual hurdle to be able to have an informed critique in this space. And so you have to spend time with it. And a lot of people are unwilling to spend that time and then take that as, an inability to kind of engage with the subject matter in a meaningful way. So I find myself not really engaging with critiques that are not based in any kind of knowledge base. And that might sound elitist in some way, but I think we have to kind of focus on things that are more productive.
Yeah, and we'll build our way out of problems. That's kind of, and that's, it's unusual that feels like a controversial thing to say.
Sure.
We're focusing specifically when you're talking about climate stuff, like we have a thread on the podcast where we're focusing specifically on developments in fusion. We've had nuclear advocates on, for example, which is a very marginal, but I believe like increasingly less marginal position. So fundamentally, I don't think either of us would claim that we have all the answers to something, but I would like to dedicate my time and brain toward at least trying to tease some of them out and not foreclosing the possibility of something good happening because it's fashionable, which is sadly the case.
Well, there's a dichotomy right now, and it's encapsulated in a great meme right now. It's called shape rotator versus word cell.
Oh.
What is that? I don't know that one.
Oh, well, anyways, it's kind of a false dichotomy between people who are more kind of like critique and language focused and those who build. And I actually would like to see kind of things merge more and seen less as kind of competitors and dichotomies. And it's something that we're also experiencing through building channels. Some of the decisions that you have to make along the way, it kind of changes my critique towards things as I build things.
Yeah, it becomes difficult when you do something.
Thank you. Before I ask my very last question, we've just got a few minutes left, but do you have a microphone ready, please? Any questions? I mean, we've got some incredible brains in this room, by the way. We have Scott Smith, we have Susan Cox-Smith, we have Noah Radford, we have Samantha, we have Antonio Carver, we have incredible people. We're going to start over here. Could you stand up, please, when you ask a question?
Please.
Thank you.
Holly, I don't know if you remember, but I organized an event in Melbourne in 2015 where you spoke with Bruce Sterling called Alien Aesthetics. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yes.
I remember that.
Yes, yes.
That was also remote, right?
It was.
Yes.
It was remote.
Yeah.
It was remote. It was really a cool event. But the reason.
Cool.
Hello.
Thank you.
It's been a long time. So at the event, this whole idea of alien aesthetics, at the time, we were talking about AI, right? And this kind of like super weird and interesting shapes and even languages, right? That were emerging from our, increasing levels of interaction with AI. But now with crypto, it's bizarre, right? What's happening with AI, because instead of being this thing that would just expand our worlds and make it so much more interesting, the opposite happened, right? It became like harvesting, bodies of these huge algorithmic intelligences, like harvesting everything out of us, right? All of our data. And then crypto arrives and it's like, okay, it's like this light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe we can regain some of our agency and our privacy. So I want to hear from you, like, what do you feel is going to happen in relation to AI, this kind of contradiction that takes place, right? Where we're fighting AI in a big way in crypto, right? So, and in the same time, how can we use AI to further our own goals? So, I don't know, it's kind of a paradox.
Thank you.
Yes.
Matt, Holly?
I don't think we're fighting AI. I think we're fighting kind of like the data mining advertising pyramid scheme of Web 2. And so I do agree with you that those are at odds. And so, of course, it behooves a Facebook or an Instagram for us to allow all of our data to be modeled and used without any kind of compensation. That's perfect for their kind of business model. And so Web3 offers a kind of light at the end of the tunnel, as you mentioned, that we're kind of modeling a little bit with Holly Plus. What if we could, make the voice freely available for everyone, but still have some sort of kind of attribution tie between, which you can see through a kind of wallet system. You can see that the DAO has approved certain use cases and that other use cases are kind of community created. So I think there's ways to use kind of provenance and kind of like artistic approval over certain use cases through Web3 kind of infrastructure that can be interesting. But I'm less maybe kind of scared of a machine learning future and more interested in trying to regain some of the agency over that conversation.
Thank you. Noah, over here, please. Man in the red T-shirt.
Hi guys, great to finally...
Noah, could you stand up just for the video,
oh,
please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Where are you guys seeing?
That way, yes.
Hi guys. Great to finally meet you. Shumon's been speaking about you for ages, and I think we've crossed paths many times. I too am sort of fundamentally optimistic about this, more or less, but I also work every day in the dark arts of politics. So I'm kind of curious as to how you might see the threat model for where this might go wrong. And what are ways that we might be able to start to prepare for and simulate and visualize that so that if it starts to go down that all too common route, we could prepare for something better?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I think fundamentally one thing that I think is really helpful in terms of talking about Web3, I don't think we take a utopian position on it. It's mostly a pragmatic position. One thing that people ought to understand is I think lots of things will go wrong. When you're talking about like open permissionless protocols that anybody can use, and anybody can use to manifest whatever they would like in an uncensorable manner, there are so many different potential threats in there. However, so that's one of these weird, I call it like the Faustian bargain of Web3, right? It's like, on the one hand, there's nothing to impede you from building new and very exciting things, but there's nothing to impede other people with those same freedoms from doing things you don't like. And so the scenario where we're at, for example, if you take this toy model, for example, of let's say in the next 3 to 5 years, there will be an explosion of increasingly realistic, increasingly imperceptible deepfakes, right? I've seen research level imagery generation that isn't public, and just we assume this is done. We assume this is over. It turns out that the proliferation of such imagery in uncensorable networks, such as decentralized networks, is kind of a big problem. What is the solution to that problem? Consensually determined open public identities where you can tell the provenance of something, right? So in a strange way, one of the things we're kind of working with at the moment is assuming the worst and then thinking, well, the worst in this case could be a forcing function toward getting us to resolve matters that we never really got a handle on with Web 2, right? So for example, like figuring out the attribution or the source of a video, being able to determine its veracity or the truth of it. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there because I would actually love to have this conversation for like an hour because I think there's a lot that can go wrong. Sorry, genuinely, I think there's a lot that can go wrong, and I would be suspicious of anybody who wouldn't concede that. But we're also in this position where I don't know if it's all that stoppable. And so really we're kind of in pragmatic, like let's make the future suck less mode on this.
I have a thought about this, and it kind of touches back to what Shumon, you were mentioning before about kind of like young people today feeling a kind of like hopelessness around the climate crisis and other kind of political events. And that can kind of go in two ways. Like Web3 can offer this opportunity to people to feel like they have more agency to build things specific to their community outside of the kind of top-down building of Web2. That's the kind of positive thing that can happen. The kind of negative thing that can happen is this hopelessness can lead people to an addiction to gambling. Because there is this hopelessness and, I might as well just kind of buy this lottery ticket. And I think we've seen a lot of those mechanics at play in both DeFi and in the NFT space. And I think that could have really negative cultural, social kind of implications. So I'm hoping that things are moving more towards the agency kind of path.
One last point on this, sorry, but exactly to that point. I mean, we were discussing the other day on the channel call this idea of like Rorschach terms, right? Where in the early 2010s, talking about having equity in a project was considered the most progressive thing possible. Now we're in a position where you can actually have equity in projects, and we see that that's complicated, right? Because equity on one hand is, kind of what's the word, like conflict of interest in another. I think that in the area, for example, of journalism, like beyond even the AI question of establishing provenance, all of a sudden the ability to establish credibility when people have stakes in all of the institutions that they're involved in, right? There was a conversation a couple of weeks ago where someone left the New York Times and was like, I can finally buy a Bitcoin, right? Ideas of conflict of interest, ideas of establishing truth, provenance, credibility in this landscape are hugely interesting, but also you can see a million ways this could go wrong. But interesting challenges to work on. Glass half full, right?
Thank you. Just got a couple of minutes. I'll take one more question. A young gentleman in the corner back there. If you could stand up, please, sir, while you ask the question. Thank you.
Okay. Where do I face?
You can face that way, that camera.
That way, yeah.
Here?
That way.
Other way.
Yeah.
Perfect.
There you are.
I have a question. how does Web3 link to AI? Like she said before, are AIs used in the Web3 world?
Amazing
And how?
question. Yeah, amazing question. Holly, AI and Web3, what's the relationship?
Oh, this is a huge question. God, I don't know. Do you have like a concept?
Okay, I would say like it depends. Why it's difficult is because the definition of AI differs from place to place.
Yeah.
The idea, for example, of also incredible question.
Right. Hardest question of the night.
But the idea, for example, a lot of
That, by the way, they're very rarely speechless.
yeah, I'm dying that I'm not there. But for example, so a lot of Web3 ideas are pretty contingent on the idea of oracles. So different sources of information confirming information in an automated way.
Yeah.
You could argue that in a sense is a form of AI. Right. When it comes specifically to like machine learning techniques, like deep learning techniques, I'm not familiar on the kind of like protocol level of too many of those things being implemented. But I do know, for example, that, you know, when you're talking about the idea of making work with AI going forward, that some of the principles in Web3 of establishing kind of open, public, verified cryptographic identities are going to be really, really crucial. But I would say when it comes to AI, specifically with Web3, yeah, like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, like DAOs, the Puritan take on a DAO would be saying that DAOs, in fact, are a form of an AI because they're a self-replicating idea that just kind of exists within this decentralized network. Now, most people who call themselves DAOs aren't actually doing that. But oracles, DAOs, I would say if you're interested in AI and Web3, that would be where to look. And please go and build a proper DAO. You'll be very successful.
I think maybe from the like art making kind of perspective, I like to think about working with machine learning as kind of collaborating with a group of collaborators that I can't see immediately, because a model is always trained on something, some kind of human activity, some kind of human intelligence went into that model. So it's not like an alien other that just comes up with the idea. It's a collaboration over time and space with many, many other people. And so when we look at the mechanics of Web 2 and how little kind of creative labor was compensated, and then we think about kind of how automated these kind of collaborations can become in the future, I think it behooves us to reconsider how we value and remunerate creative contribution moving forward. And so I'm hoping that Web3 comes up with some creative solutions to that. I hope that made sense.
Absolutely. And thank you to the young gentleman who asked the question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, please follow me on Twitter.
Next time you can do my job. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Ishan.
Could that be his mother?
No.
Yes, sir. Tell us who you are.
My name is Ishan.
What are you doing at school at the moment, Ishan? Are you working on Web3 projects?
No, we're working on creating a website.
Are you creating a website? Fantastic. Okay. Well, we look forward to seeing that as it develops. Holly, Matt, my last question is a cover version of your last question. You always ask your guests at the end what interdependence means to them. But no, what I want to ask you is, has your own understanding of that word interdependence evolved over the last 2 years? And where do you see it going to next, please?
Okay, well, I'll give it a go. I mean, obviously, in light of what's been happening the past couple of weeks, the term has come up in much the way that it came up a lot in political science in the 1970s. I think that fundamentally, you know, we've always framed interdependence in a very positive light, through basically suggesting, I mean, long story short, that there's been kind of an overemphasis in Web 2 and in creative fields on the kind of myth of the individual, and, you know, ultimately that interdependence is the truth of the matter. the truth of the matter is that for cultural events, special cultural things to happen, special pieces of art to happen, ultimately that process is an interdependent process. It is an interdependent process, and it would be nice to build systems to better complement that. And by that same token, by saying that interdependence is the truth, there are also, in cases like what's been happening in the past couple of weeks, negative associations to that, right? It is also a bitter truth in some cases that we are all tied together geopolitically. That can be sometimes a bitter truth when some things go off the rails. But I think the point remains. The point remains that interdependence is the truth of the matter, and building toward that truth, in my mind, is the most exciting area to be in. I won't rant any more about Ted Nelson and Tim Berners-Lee, but
we'll save that.
I feel like that dynamic has a very deep and rich history, actually, of building for the individual or building for the network, and that's my 2 cents. I'll throw this ball over to Holly. She's really looking forward to it.
I think that's a great answer.
Oh,
I feel like for me, it's kind of like the scale and time horizon has changed maybe a little bit. I think when we started out, I was thinking more about kind of like artist ecosystems and how all of the different kind of parts fit together. And through working with machine learning so many insane hours the last year, I think I've started to view it as a kind of collaboration with the archive of human intelligence. So kind of collaborating with humans from the past, and hopefully whatever I'm creating today will be a collaboration with humans in the future. And I know that might sound a little bit psychedelic, but it's been making me think more about the kind of way that we treat the archive and the way that we treat our kind of shared human intellectual journey. So I think I'm thinking about interdependence on a much broader time horizon now.
I do have to say, that speaking with all the pilled discussion, the more we've dived into these particularly the new machine learning systems, you do end up with a kind of fried psychedelic perspective on things. I've been surprised, being kind of like a very rational kind of materialist, hard-nosed materialist most of my life. I'm like, oh wait, okay, conversing with the archive of human intellect sounds like far more reasonable to me than it did a couple of years ago.
We've run out of time. I just want to let everyone know we're going to go straight onto our next session, which is going to be fantastic. But if you have to leave, if you could leave as quickly and as quietly as possible, I'd appreciate that. Otherwise, do hold on. There's 3 more amazing sessions. But Holly, Matt, thank you so much for sharing your minds, your generosity, your warmth. We miss you here, and we hope that in the future we can actually do this IRL again. Everyone, a huge round of applause to Holly, Herndon and Mat Dryhurst.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. We're devastated to not be there, but we will be there in future, and I look forward to seeing the rest of the sessions.
And thank you for all the work that you do, Shumon.
Yeah, really, genuinely.
A pleasure.
A light.
Bye, guys. Take
Bye.
care.
Have a sweet day. Ciao.